Hello friends, welcome to this session of our class on modern exegesis of the Quran. This is another special session because we have a distinguished guest with us, and I'd like to say a couple of words to introduce him, and then we'll enter into our conversation about modern exegesis. Exegesis, of course, is a word which means something like understanding or commentary or reflection on a scripture. Professor Munim Suri, who's our guest, is an assistant professor in the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, and he also is one of the leading scholars working on the Contending Modernities initiative at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He did his PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of Chicago at the Divinity School there, and his work there contributed to a number of publications, and I thought I'd mention a couple of them. The first, perhaps the most prominent, is his book, which is Scriptural Polemics, the Quran and Other Religions, which we have here with us today. And he's also published a number of articles, including an article entitled Muslim Prayer and Public Spheres, an interpretation of the Quranic verse 945, and he wrote that along with a South African professor named Rashid Omar. And a good topic for the question which we'll address today, he wrote an article entitled What's Modern about Modern Tafsir, tafsir meaning exegesis, the Islamic word, or rather Arabic word for exegesis, and then the subtitle of that article, A Closer Look at an Indonesian Reformist Tafsir. With that, I thought we could turn to our topic now, and I can officially welcome Professor Suri. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
No, thank you for having me here.
So there's a lot to speak about. We've just had a session for our course on classical exegesis of the Quran. And now with you, we turn to modern exegesis of the Quran. And I think we'll try to figure out, so what's distinctive? Sometimes people have this tendency of assuming that Islam never really changes, that everything's the same. And even scholars today are really medieval in the way that they think of things. And so I imagine we'll see that it's more complicated than that, but we'll discuss that together. I wanted to start with your book, if that's okay, Scriptural Polemics. In the introduction, you mentioned that generally, for all sorts of commentaries, it's important to keep context in mind. You say social and historical context. At one point, you write this, sort of chastising scholars who have ignored context. You write, by removing these commentaries from the historical, social, and political context, it is impossible to fully understand them and their discursive context. Could you explain that a little bit? Well, why do you have to know context to understand a commentary on the Quran? Excuse me.
Sure. Well, one of the purpose of that book is particularly to examine modern Muslim interpretation of difficult passages of the Quran that have been observed and have been viewed as obstacle to interreligious conversation. So I asked a very simple question: how their local and modern context shape their understanding of difficult passages of the Quran.
Right.
And therefore, to understand the local context and modern context that shape modern interpretation of the Quran, I examine modern tafsir written by scholars from different parts of the Muslim world, which include one from Egypt. Maybe I mention name because we will come back later on in our conversation. Rashid Rida wrote a tafsir called Tafsir Al-Manar. Rashid Rida from Egypt, so Jamil Al-Qasimi from Syria, Tabatabai from Iran, Muhammad Jawad Maghriya from Lebanon, and also Hamka from Indonesia, as well as Abul Kalam Azad from India. So these 6 scholars I examine closely in their interpretation how local and modern context shape their understanding of the Quran.
So I was going to ask, sort of connected to this. You sort of suggest, I think, in the introduction that context is particularly important for modernist tafsir, understanding more recent commentaries, vis-a-vis maybe classical commentaries. So you've just mentioned that the scholars you've worked on in this book come from a wide geographical range, all the way from Egypt to Indonesia and many places in between. Could you speak to that a bit? I mean, why does context become more important in our efforts to understand modern commentaries on the Quran?
Absolutely. As medieval tafsir commentaries reflect their own historical context, anthropological and political context, so too modern Quran commentaries. If you look at these Quran commentaries, you can see how they bring their own local context into their interpretation of the Quran. I may give you one example just to make this point very clear. One of the 6 Quran commentators that I deal in that book is Hamka,
Right.
Indonesian
The Indonesian
Indonesian scholar.
Yes.
Hamka is a pen name. His full name is Haji Abdul Karim Malik Amrullah, meaning just acronym is Hamka, and he began writing his tafsir in the 1960s and 1970s. At the time, the issue of nominal Muslim was like hot issue. Nominal Muslim meaning that those Muslims who declare themselves as Muslim but never practicing the religion. As you know, that Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, with more than 200 million Muslims there, and about 15% of the total population are Christians and many other local indigenous religions. So those indigenous communities, they prefer to call themselves as Muslim, representing the larger, because they feel safer to call themselves as Muslim.
Protected under the majority community.
So they are Muslim on their ID card, but not really practicing Muslim. So that was like one of the hot issues in the 1960s and 1970s. So when Hamka interpreting the Quran, chapter 2, verse 62, which says that those who believe, Jews, Christian, and Sabian, whoever believe in God and the last day, and work righteousness,
will have the reward
with their God. So when he interprets this alladhina amanu, those who believe, which is often understood as referring to Muslim, he said that this is only name. So name is not important. Just like people who declare themselves as Muslim on ID card.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So I mean, he brings his own local context into the interpretation of the Quran, suggesting that name is not important. What is important is 2 things. One is belief in God in the last day, and the second one is doing righteousness.
Righteous work.
Right. So that is like the substance of the verse. It's not like the title, Muslim and or Jews or Christians.
Right.
Yes.
So I was thinking, if we, on the one hand, emphasize context, in the modern context, in this case, the Indonesian context, which I think is your own background as well.
Yes.
It's Indonesian. So if we emphasize this on the one hand, which would sort of show how maybe what's distinct about modern commentaries on the Quran, surely they must also have an element in their work which is reliant on the classical tradition. Could you speak about that a bit? I mean, how reliant are modern commentators on the Quran on their the classical works?
Right. The way modern Muslims, interpreters of the Quran, rely on classical commentaries varies from one another. Some are more heavily relying on classical Quran commentaries, others are not. Hamka, for instance, he relied on both classical and modern tafsir.
Other modern tafsirs.
Right. He heavily relied on both classical and modern tafsir. In his introduction to his tafsir, he delineated and explained his method as well as list of sources that he used in his interpretation of the Quran. So, for instance, he mentioned the 10th century Muslim exegete Tabari, as well as a tafsir by Rashid Rida, 20th century tafsir. So he both rely on both classical and modern. Mufassir from Quran commentator from India, for instance, Abul Kalam Azad, he rarely rely on classical tafsir, but rather he rely on mostly Indian. For instance, he in few places he mentioned Shah Wali ad-Dahlawi, who is 18th century Indian Muslim scholar. So some of the scholars that I examined in my book, some are somehow critical to classical tafsir.
That's interesting, because I would think that there'd be a notion that the earlier commentators, who are closer chronologically to the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and the companions who were around the Prophet Muhammad and the successors, that there would be a notion almost of a golden age of commentary. That those would be the ones sort of closest to the messenger of God and therefore God's word. But it's not always the case.
No, not the case. I can mention Rashid Rida, for instance, who wrote tafsir called Tafsir Al-Manar.
Who's the Syrian?
He was
Syrian who worked in Egypt.
Then he lived in Egypt. He was the disciple of the perhaps the most well-known Egyptian reformer, Muhammad Abduh, when he wrote this tafsir, he criticized classical Quran commentaries, saying that you can find everything in classical tafsir except tafsir itself. So when Ar-Razi, for instance, medieval Quran commentators, when he interpret as-samawat wal ard, meaning the heaven and the earth, he used the astronomy and all this thing, which has, according to Rashidida, has nothing to do with tafsir itself. So
actually understanding God's
word. Right. And another Shi'i scholar, Tabatabai, he also critical of the historicity of the occasion of revelation, which is one genre in the tafsir tradition, meaning that to understand the Quran, you have to understand the circumstance in which certain passage of the Quran was revealed. So the historicity of the report regarding these asbab an-nuzul, of the occasion of revelation, was put into question.
Okay, right. Interesting. So we see this dialectic or this conversation in almost tension at times that goes on between modern and classical commentators.
Right, exactly right.
Something that's different, of course, for a modern commentator is modernity.
Yes.
That sounds maybe simplistic, but what I mean is that there are certain elements of thinking in the modern period, what we call generally modernity.
Right.
But here, not just meaning technology and things. Maybe technology actually is part of it. But principally, certain values about human rights or equality between the sexes or other sorts of elements, maybe even about the virtue of sort of pluralism in terms of religions and things.
Right.
Those are sorts of values that maybe principally come from the West, and therefore maybe in some Muslim commentators' eyes sort of from the Christian world, even though the West we know is not perfectly Christian, etc. But how important are those in exerting pressure on the way that modern commentators went about understanding the Quran? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, if you look at modern Quran commentaries, they certainly deal with both the classical sources, but also the project of thinking Islam in light of the challenges of modernity. So the rapid change that caused by migration, transportation, and communication, for instance, what people call as global village right now. So this kind of a pluralized world has become a big issue among modern Muslim commentators. So when they look at the Quran, when they think of the Quran, they try to find a solution. They try to find guidance to answer this very basic question: how to make the Quran relevant in the modern context? How to make the Quran? What is the role of the Quran in the modern context?
So maybe I can give a specific example. Maybe you have a better one than this. But I'm thinking about the verse we find in the fourth surah that seems to give license to polygamy, at least was traditionally understood. I think it's the third verse in chapter 4 of Surah An-Nisa, or the chapter of the women, which speaks about maybe the permission to marry 2 or 3 or 4 women. It seems to say that. Maybe there's an allusion to concubinage, also to having a concubine. But it also says, if you're afraid of not doing justice to your wives, then one is better. Maybe you could speak a bit about in the modern context where polygamy, at least through the lens of Western values, is frowned upon. Has that had an impact on how Muslim scholars interpret this verse?
Right. Let me say something about the context of the verse itself, because it seems like this verse has been much discussed by scholars. And certainly Muhammad Abduh and Rashidida, the two modern Muslim commentators of the Quran, deal with this verse extensively. Because according to general understanding of the verse, that Islam allowed for up to 4 wives. The verse saying that if you find a good woman, you can marry 2, 3, and 4. But then the phrase following that sentence is saying that if you are afraid that you will not be just, then only one, fawahida. So according to Rashidida, when interpreting this verse in particular, he's saying that because justice is impossible in terms of love, and therefore Islam does allow only one wife. Monogamous. So that's how the modern context shaped their understanding, though it is commonly agreed among scholars that Islam allow for 4 wives, but still when interpreting this particular verse, Rashidida and Abdul claim that only one wife because the condition is impossible, which is justice.
So that's an example of a scholar, in this case Rashid Rida,
Right.
who sort of negotiates things with modernity.
Yeah.
If this is the right term, maybe you can
Right,
correct me
yeah.
on this. But
No,
sort of
no, it's
negotiates, says, actually, we agree with this modern value of monogamy, if it's in a modern value, but we agree with monogamy,
Right.
and Islam actually properly understood as monogamous. Are there other commentators who sort of push back against that, who say that Islam should be
Right.
understood strictly as it has been always? For example, I don't know if this is a good verse, but this verse suggests that you can marry up to 4 women, maybe even have concubines, and that's it. I don't care if we're looked upon sort of negatively by Western non-Muslim
Right.
eyes. Our teaching is what it is, and we're not going to change because of modern pressures.
Of course, there are diverse approaches to the Quran. What I just mentioned is a kind of modernist interpretation of the Quran.
Right.
And there are other approaches that seem to push back the challenge of modernity, the concept of modernity, and more focusing on how to purify the Islamic teaching, in spite of the fact that that it is very difficult. What do you mean by purifying the teaching?
Right.
What is the most authentic teaching of Islam?
Yes.
And this tendency is generally called as Salafi tendency of interpreting the
It's
Quran.
difficult because
Right.
even in the classical commentaries, there are many different voices that you find there.
Right. So the Salafi interpretation of the Quran seems to suggest that what makes Islam backward is because we turn away from Islam. So what they want to do is to bring back the pristine teaching of Islam, which is the first 3 generations of Muslims.
Right.
So to bring back, this is the reason why they were called Salafis, because the word Salaf itself means the forefathers, meaning the first 3 generations.
Yes.
So this is the generation what they call as the most pristine teaching of Islam.
Right. So we find both there.
Yes.
I wanted to turn to maybe the principal topic.
Sure.
That is sort of your path to exploring modern exegesis in your book, which is the question of the Quran's verses on other religions and the relationship between Muslims and other believers or unbelievers, depending on the passage, how they describe. A brief anecdote maybe is a good way of starting this, which is I gave a talk once about the Quran and the Bible, and after the talk, a Muslim came up to me, along with a Christian friend of his, and he said, there's this verse in the Quran in chapter 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah, which says, O you who believe, do not take the Christians and the Jews as friends. As you know, the Arabic word is awliya.
Yeah.
So he said, as friends. He said, well, how do you understand this? Does this mean I can't be friends with this guy next to me? So I wonder, I don't know if you want to speak about that particular verse, but how do modern exegetes deal with passages like that in which the Quran seems to take a strident or confrontational position vis-a-vis Christians, Jews, and other non-Muslims?
Well, the Quran itself has no coherent position with regard to how Muslims should ethically treat the other, right? You can find in the Quran passages that seem to promote the idea of tolerance, that non-Muslims should be tolerated. And even verses that seem to extend salvific promise to the other. So on the other hand, you can also find in the Quran those passages that seem to promote more violent attitude toward the other. So there is no coherent attitude in the Quran. And this also reflects in Muslim understanding of the Quran itself. So one way to synthesize these 2 conflicting positions of the Quran is that they refer to what they call as asbab nuzul, the occasion of revelation, in order to make sense of this conflicting position. And the second one is by referring to the theory what later called as nasakh theory, meaning the theory of abrogation, that certain passages of the Quran have been abrogated by the other. So the later passages have abrogated the early one and therefore becoming inactive.
So it's the later ones that are valid sort of legally or morally.
Yes, this is one way to find a solution of this conflicting.
I was going to ask about the first of the 2 strategies, which was to look at the occasions of revelation for a certain verse.
Right.
Let's say you do this, and I guess my question is, what's the point or what's the goal? So let's say you have a certain verse, maybe the one I spoke about not taking Jews and Christians as friends. they're friends of one another, it says.
Yeah.
Is that a way of saying, well, this verse really matters for the days or the time of the Prophet?
Right.
It doesn't apply anymore in the 21st century.
Yeah, this is one strategy that modern Muslim scholars develop in a way they interpret these difficult passages, these passages that seem to allow for violence, right? So they try to particularize the Quranic discourse.
Right.
Instead of saying that this verse is universal in the application, they say that this verse only applicable in certain circumstances.
But the Quran is still the word of God.
Sure, this
And all of it, all 114 surahs, right?
All 114 surahs are the word of God, but they were revealed in certain circumstances, and it take local context into the verse of the Quran itself. So the Quran, to some extent, reflect its own historical context.
So it's, you see, the task of the interpreter is complicated.
Sure,
it
sure,
involves
it is, yeah.
Yeah, understanding, in a sense, the context in which the Quran was originally revealed or proclaimed, depending on your perspective, and also thinking about its application in the modern context. So there are different sorts of contexts to keep in mind.
Right. Both context, both the Quran, when the Quran was revealed, and also the context of interpreter themselves, right? So both, yeah.
Can I ask you about another
Sure.
specific verse, which is, we were speaking about Quran 5, which was this bit about friendship with Jews and Christians, but there's another verse which is sort of difficult to wrestle with if you're interested in the peaceful relationship between different religions, which is Quran in Surah At-Tawbah, or chapter 9, verse 29, which it commands, it seems to command the believers to fight against the Jews and Christians.
Right.
Maybe. Because it's a bit complicated. It
Yeah.
says those who don't believe in the last day don't establish religion as it should be established, etc.
And then from among the people of the book.
From among the people of the book, exactly. So it seems to though ultimately encourage some sort of opposition to Jews and Christians, maybe even fighting, because that's the word, right?
It is, yes.
Etc. How does a Muslim more inclined, I don't know if it's Hamkar or someone else, inclined towards pluralism, deal with that sort of verse?
Well, they find ways to interpret the verse differently. One is by looking at the context of revelation itself, saying that this verse was revealed in certain particular context when Jews or Christians were hatred to Muslim, right? Only in that hostile environment that this verse can be applied. And secondly, by saying that even those ideas such as the jizya in the Quran, right, the jizya in the verse, because the verse,
this word that seems to mean a
right,
poll tax,
meaning
that
poll
Christians
tax,
or Jews
right,
would
and the
pay.
verse itself, verse chapter 9, verse 29, mentioned the word jizya, which is only, this is the only one in the Quran that the word jizya was mentioned, right? So Rasulullah, for instance, when dealing with this verse, saying that this idea of jizya is not Quranic invention. This idea and practice has been there in Arabia before the coming of Islam. So this is not an Islamic invention, and therefore it is a political institution rather than what Islam really want in organizing Muslim, non-Muslim citizenship in Islamic land. Yeah.
Great. I wanted to ask two more questions.
Sure,
That's
please,
okay.
yes.
Then I'll let you.
Of course,
I'll let you be in peace.
No. It's a very wonderful conversation. Yeah.
So you have one of the sections of your book. It's actually the subtitle to one chapter. You use a question for it, which is the Quran supersessionist?
Yeah.
Some of our students might know this term from conversations about Christianity and Judaism.
Right.
But here you're using it in terms of the Quran. Could you explain the term, what that means, and how it applies to the Quran?
So yeah, the term supersession in Arabic is called nasakh, meaning abrogation. This theory of abrogation is basically primarily dealing with that certain passages of the Quran abrogate the other.
Right. So internal
abrogation. But then later on, this idea of abrogation is expanded to include that Islam abrogate pre-Islamic religion, including Judaism and Christianity. Certainly this idea is not in the Quran, right? The Quran only mentions that one certain passages abrogate the other. So the idea that Islam abrogate the other, meaning that the coming of Islam, the advent of Islam, but by the time Islam come, then therefore all other religions have been abrogated. This
Right.
is a later development. It's not in the Quran. The Quran, if you look at the Quran in fact affirm the divine origin of all religion, right? Notably Jews and Christians, in the sense that they receive divine revelation.
Right.
In the Quran used the word musaddiq, meaning confirming what
Right.
have been revealed to both Jews and Christians. So the idea of abrogation, that Islam supersede
Yes.
is Quranic religion,
Right.
is basically later development.
But I mean, we have verses in the Quran which seem to say very clearly that the only acceptable religion is Islam.
Right.
You know, inna dina andallahi al-Islam. Religion, if that's the right
Right,
translation,
yes.
religion with God is Islam. Another one in Quran chapter 3 says, whoever chooses a religion, deen again is the word, other than God will be a loser.
Right.
So how can the
Yeah.
Quran not be supersessionist?
Well, some Quran commentators, including the modern one, argue that the word Islam there doesn't refer to the name of religion brought by the Prophet, by Muhammad, but rather Islam in its generic meaning submission.
The actual meaning of the word, the Arabic
right,
word Islam.
the literal meaning of the word, which is submission, or submission to the will of God. So in the Deen and Islam, the true religion with God is submission to God. Basically, that one way to interpret the verse. And the other way is that you look at, as I said earlier, that there is a passage that seems to suggest that Islam is the only true path to salvation.
Right.
But there is another verse in the Quran that seems to open for the possibility of the plurality of religion, that all other religions should be tolerated.
Yes.
One example is chapter 2, verse 256, I guess,
Right.
saying that La ikraha fid din, meaning
Right.
there is no
Compulsion
compulsion in religion. And then another, I think verse 6 in chapter 109, saying lakum dinukum waliyadin, meaning for you your religion and for me mine, meaning that even though Islam claimed to be the only true path to salvation, but it also allows for the possibility of religious pluralism, meaning like the plurality of religion.
So we can see how much, I think this is an important lesson from our conversation with you, how much rationality plays a role in Quranic interpretation, maybe particularly among modern exegetes, but
Right.
also in the classical period in different ways probably, but just to think that a proper understanding means studying a word like Islam. What does that word actually mean?
Right.
I used the word in my long drawn out question. I mentioned the word deen. What is deen? We usually translate as religion, but religion
It's more
is
complex, yeah.
I mean, isn't religion in some ways a modern idea? Exactly.
Yeah.
What does religion encompass as an ideal?
Sure, yeah, that's very right.
Well, there's one. Thank you.
No.
There's one last question I wanted to ask you, and it's a topic that's really important today, which is differences between Sunni and Shiite Islam.
Yeah.
And it seems in the contemporary period that this is one of the greatest, most important issues for the future of the world, because we see all of these conflicts in places like Iraq and Syria, of course, also Yemen, also Pakistan, other places, Saudi Arabia itself, between Sunnis and Shiites.
Exactly.
But it's not only a question of sort of political or military conflict. There are also different sort of traditions when it comes to interpretation of the Quran.
Right.
And I know that at least one of the commentators you studied in your book is a Shiite, Tabatabai, you've already mentioned him.
Yeah.
Could you speak a bit about, is there anything distinctive about a Shiite approach to the text vis-a-vis a Sunni approach?
Yeah, of course there are some distinctive approaches to the Quran among Shiites, but let me say this first, because there are some overlapping views also, meaning that certain approaches were adopted by both Sunnis and Shia Muslims.
We shouldn't exaggerate
but
and
of
think
course,
that they're
but of
completely
course,
independent.
but of course, on certain issues that deal with their contested theological issues between Sunnis and Muslims, they differ significantly, especially on the question of the question of leadership, the question of imamat, because as you know that Sunnis and Shiites approach the question of imamat differently. For Shiites, imamat, I mean the leadership after the death of the Prophet is appointed through divine designation, meaning that Ali
Right.
who is
Wasn't
the
elected.
cousin and Muhammad
Right.
son-in-law,
Yes.
according to Shi'is, was appointed as his successor
Yes.
through divine order.
Right.
That Muhammad himself chose him as his successor.
Right.
Well, according to Sunnis, the leadership is appointed through the consensus of the community, meaning that Abu Bakr, according to Shi'i understanding and according to Sunni understanding,
Right.
was appointed as a caliph through consensus of the Ummah.
Yes.
So when dealing with this question of the appointment of leadership, they differ significantly, including the verse that you just mentioned in chapter 5 of the Quran, verse 3, I guess, which says that Al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum wa atmamtu alaykum ni'mati wa raditu lakumul islam dina. Today I have perfected your religion and I have completed my favor upon you, and I have pleased for you Islam as your religion.
Yes.
So in the Shi'i understanding of this verse, the idea of completion, that Islam is the perfect and complete religion, is because Muhammad has already chosen Ali as his successor.
So the community somehow will pass on after the death of the
Right.
Prophet to a new sort of leadership or guidance, divinely chosen.
Right,
that
and
of
therefore
Ali.
Islam become complete, perfect. But Sunni understanding of this verse, they understand differently.
Right.
They often avoid, alluding to, referring to this in this verse in terms of the historical context of the verse.
Right. Yes.
But rather understood the completion in terms of either that Islam supersede the other, is the only true path to salvation, or that Islam allow for more reason to play, more ijtihad, and therefore it can adaptable to different circumstances, and therefore it is a perfect religion.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, this is fascinating to see that we began with sort of the diversity of different contexts. You mentioned the Indonesian example from your own country,
Right,
Indonesia, of Hamkar, and how the social and political context of Indonesia leads to certain interpretations. But we also see on a sectarian sort of question that
Right.
there are certain elements which are distinctive for Shiites or Sunnis. So maybe this is a good lesson to conclude with, that
Sure.
there's great diversity and complications involved in the task of interpretation. And of course, it's immensely important, I think, because
Exactly.
so much of how Muslims going forward will understand the text of the Quran is a function of interpretation. It's the text itself isn't everything, it's the interpretation also.
So, I agree.
Thank you. It's been a delight speaking with you and an education.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.